The Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management will come to order. Chairman asks unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Chairman also asks unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. The chairman now recognizes himself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to continue the subcommittee's discussion on the state of federal real estate and discuss the eye-opening work that the Government Accountability Office just completed. The subcommittee held a roundtable on the state of federal real estate in March that highlighted the major challenges with the federal government's real estate portfolio. The buildings largely are old, in disrepair, and underutilized. Federal real property continues to be on the GAO's high-risk list for about 20 years. And even before COVID, we had far too much empty space in our portfolio. Unfortunately, the ongoing telework policies have only exacerbated that problem. Here are some basic facts we highlighted in our roundtable. Federal occupancy in the Washington, D.C. area alone remains below 50% of pre-COVID levels. Nearly 30% of federal employees live outside their assigned areas, and 30% of federal employees are expected to retire in the next 5 years. More than 50% of the General Services Administration's leases are expiring in the next 5 years. And we are receiving growing reports of shadow space in both owned and leased buildings. And shadow space is, I guess, a nice term for saying it's empty. There's not many people there. It's just simply mostly vacant or very much vacant. However, after being briefed by GAO on their latest report that they will testify on today, I have now been informed just how far off occupancy rates are and how hard space utilization rates are to calculate, how difficult it is to calculate space utilization rates. I will defer to GAO to report their findings and look forward to further discussion, but I do want to highlight one key finding. A majority of the agencies GAO reviewed used 25% or less of their headquarters building space. 25%. Let that sink in. And the taxpayer is paying for the remaining 75% of the agency's unused space. The taxpayer is paying for all of it, but they're using 25%. Taxpayers paying for 75% not being used. It's not as though the GSA can't just close down, shut off the lights, and mothball the unused space to reduce cost. I wish that were the case. The taxpayer is quite literally paying to keep the lights on even when no one is home, and the lights are just the beginning of it, right? There's security, there's utilities, there's upkeep when nobody's there. And if this trend is any indication of space usage and lease space, we are wasting literally billions of dollars each year. I've been a firm believer that if agencies aren't using their space, they got to give it up. Got to give it up. Let's be clear, this goes beyond bringing federal employees back to the office because even pre-COVID, we knew space utilization was an issue. This subcommittee, GSA, GAO, and the private sector experts have been discussing this for a very long time. We need to get a handle on this and push agencies, require agencies. If they won't do it, we're going to have to help them do it. And I don't mean help in the good way, right? We're from the government and we're here to help, but we have to examine how they're using their space, and there must be more accountability for agencies. There are people in charge of these places, and if you're in charge, you got to take care of business, and if you don't want to, someone else is going to, and that someone's going to be us. I hope we can use the GAO report as a baseline to understand the current challenge so we can pass legislation that will meaningfully help the government right-size its portfolio and either use or get rid of, maybe that's not the right term, get rid of. Let it go to the private sector. Let other people use it. Let some other agency use it. Let some other government level, let the municipality, let the county, let someone else use it. But it can't go unused and paid for. That's unacceptable. With that, this will conclude my opening statement. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, Ms. Albert and Mr. Maroney, for being here. They have participated in these discussions with us at the round table and in this committee. We've got the people who know this business and who can help us with it here at the table. Commissioner of General Services Administration's Public Building Services, and Mr. Maroney, the Acting Director of Physical Infrastructure at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Maroney, I especially appreciate the time and effort that you and your team have devoted to the topic that we're discussing today. If it weren't for the 20 years of high-risk reports that y'all have put out, we might not even be aware of the problem, so thank you for that. As you heard the chairman say, with the expiration of COVID-19, the health emergency, the use of maximum telework for federal employees has ended. And the Office of Management and Budget has directed agencies to update their post-entry plans. And agencies have responded. Let's give them credit where credit's due. DOE, EPA, Federal FDIC, the VA, FEMA, Department of Education, and Department of Treasury have all published their increased in-work requirements. And let's also be clear about the purposes of this hearing. We need to remember that GSA doesn't set federal work policies. They don't have the authority to demand that federal employees return to their desk. GSA provides the real estate and the real estate services to civilian agencies and helps those agencies define their space, but it does not establish or implement federal workforce policies. The frequency of federal employees' in-person work schedules varies widely across agencies and even within agencies, and it's often determined by department heads or supervisors in those different categories. Even though some agencies are sorting through their in-office policies, the truth is we're still in the middle of this shift in the real estate market, and this could take a long time to play out. We need to recognize that. But returning to work is only part of the issue at hand. Within the next 3 years, half of GSA's almost 8,000 leases will expire, and the agency has insufficient capital to repair and modernize the 1,500 buildings that it owns. Persistent underfunding of the Federal Buildings Fund, outdated and damaged facilities, frustrated tenants, expensive short-term lease renewals, insufficient funding for new construction, damage to buildings from extreme weather conditions that will get even worse with climate change, and a slow prospectus approval process, all combined to make it challenging for GSA to modernize and right-size its portfolio. These are all concerns that were expressed at our roundtable, expressed by constituents, and expressed by you all. But we can't wait decades to sort this out. I agree with the chairman. Congress and this subcommittee specifically have a real opportunity now to improve space efficiency in our government portfolio and dispose of underutilized real estate, both of which will save taxpayers sufficient money, a lot of dollars, significant amount of dollars, and that's one of our priorities. So I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, to working with members on both sides of the aisle and the chairman to address some of these problems that I've laid out before. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady from Nevada. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Perry and Ranking Member Titus, for holding this very important hearing on the utilization of federal office space. Managing federal real property has been on GAO's high-risk list for 20 years, as noted. Access to capital, the lack of reliable real property data for decision-making, and a cumbersome process for disposing of excess and underutilized real estate has made it challenging for GSA to carry out its mission. The Obama-era freeze the footprint and reduce the footprint policies decreased the size of GSA's portfolio from 8,925 leases to 7,760 leases, and 190 million square feet to 180 million square feet. That is great, but I think it shows how difficult it is to dispose of excess property. However, underutilization has become even more widespread during the pandemic, even though 8 federal agencies made limited reductions to the amount of space they leased. As the COVID-19 emergency has wound down, OMB required agencies to bring staff back into their offices and determine their future space requirements. But the in-office workforce has not returned to pre-pandemic levels due to increased and legitimate use of remote work. In this environment where agencies are unsure of their long-term space needs, GSA faces significant challenges. GSA must decide when to lease space or to increase its owned portfolio and move as many agencies as possible in that owned space. These challenges present GSA with an opportunity therefore to improve the size, quality, and utilization of the federal real estate portfolio. I look forward to learning how GSA is mitigating the financial liability of vacant lease space, whether GSA knows which of its buildings are cash positive, and whether GSA has a list of buildings that should be disposed of over the next 5 years. The Inflation Reduction Act provides GSA with $250 million as well to convert facilities to high-performance green buildings. It's a great opportunity for GSA to build upon the previous success in greening our federal facilities. However, we need to know which buildings GSA needs to keep. So I hope to hear from GSA today about how these funds are being used and whether the long-term viability and potential profitability of a building is considered when GSA makes these investment decisions. This hearing is an opportunity to begin, or actually continue discussions about what the federal real estate portfolio should look like in the future, and how Congress can help GSA meet some of its challenges. So I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on how we can right-size the federal real estate portfolio and to save taxpayer dollars. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the ranking member of the full committee. Chair would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights right in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means to conclude your remarks. It should be pretty self-explanatory. I think you get about 5 minutes, right? So hopefully you plan for that. The chair asks for unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Maroney, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee. All right. Thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the preliminary results of GAO's ongoing work on the utilization of federal headquarters buildings. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government has a unique opportunity to reconsider how much office space it really needs. To get a sense of the magnitude of that opportunity, we assessed the extent to which 24 agencies utilized their headquarters buildings in January, February, and March of this year. What we found was that all 24 of those headquarters buildings had extra space, and that most agencies were using less than 25% of their headquarters capacity on average. While these figures are estimates, they point to a potentially large amount of unneeded office space within headquarters buildings and possibly beyond. We identified 3 main reasons for this low utilization. First, many agencies had more space than they needed even before the pandemic. One of the reasons federal real property management has remained on GAO's high-risk list now for 20 years. Many headquarters buildings were built decades ago, before technology enabled an agencies to do more with fewer workers. But the buildings remain the same size, so you end up with unneeded space. For example, we calculated that for one agency, even if all of its assigned staff came into its headquarters building on a single day, it would still only use 2/3 of the building's capacity. Second, many headquarters buildings aren't configured in the best way. For example, some include storage areas and administrative spaces that simply aren't needed in the modern workplace, and some are configured with larger offices than are needed today. Third, agencies have embraced hybrid work. Telework and remote work existed before the pandemic, but those workplace flexibilities are used much more frequently now. As a result, there are simply fewer people coming into headquarters buildings than there were before the pandemic. So why does this matter? Because low building utilization has significant costs, both to the government and to the American taxpayer. For one thing, there are the financial costs. It costs billions of dollars each year to operate, maintain, and lease these buildings. Reducing unneeded space would save taxpayer money. In addition, holding on to unneeded office space has environmental costs. Office buildings take a significant amount of energy to run, whether people are at their desks or not. Finally, holding on to unneeded space has opportunity costs. Every dollar an agency spends on unneeded space is a dollar that can't be used for other priorities. And how much economic benefit do buildings used at a quarter of their capacity really provide to the local economy? Housing, hotels, and other uses could provide more local benefits. To be clear, figuring out how much office space agencies really need and shedding any they don't won't be easy or cost-free. There are a number of challenges to doing so, including continuing uncertainty about agency and office policies and a lack of consistent standards or targets for how agencies should measure utilization. That said, the status quo can't hold. Agencies have been in a wait-and-see mode for more than 3 years. They need to decide how much office space they really need and start moving in that direction. That's important for agency missions, for local communities, and the American taxpayer. In conclusion, underused federal buildings have been and continue to be a costly challenge, and hybrid work has made that challenge more acute. The federal government now has a unique opportunity to reconsider how much office space it really needs. Agencies should take a hard look and act to right-size their real estate portfolios. Only by doing so will the federal government be able to take advantage of the current moment, optimize the federal footprint, and save taxpayer money. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my opening statement. I'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Maroney. Next, Commissioner Albert, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Nina Albert, and I'm the Commissioner of the Public Building Service at the General Services Administration. I appreciate the committee's invitation to discuss opportunities to improve building utilization as well as right-size the federal footprint. In GSA's role as the government's largest civilian real estate provider, we help agencies develop real estate solutions that best support their missions and which deliver best value to the American people. I had the honor of appearing before this subcommittee in June of '22 and again in March of this year at the Chairman's Roundtable discussion. Today, I'm prepared to talk about how office owners and occupants are evaluating space utilization and how strategies to right-size the federal footprint can be accelerated by GSAs gaining full access to the Federal Buildings Fund and by streamlining GSA's authorities to maintain and dispose of real property. The pandemic highlighted the need for operational resilience, and many agencies have since realized that they can adapt their workplaces to more efficiently and cost-effectively carry out their missions. Since 2021, as directed by OMB memos M-21-25 and M-23-15, agencies have been evaluating how work environments can be improved to enhance mission delivery for the future, including evaluating the impacts of telework and other operational policies. As these evaluations are completed, GSA is prepared to leverage its expertise to help agencies optimize their real estate needs. However, support for GSA's FY24 budget request, which proposes key legislative reforms as well as $2.3 billion for its capital program, is critical to both modernizing as well as right-sizing the federal footprint. Deferring these authorities or limiting the investment in essential infrastructure further exacerbates our problems and delays consolidation plans. It also forces the government to lease out of necessity while still carrying space we no longer need. All of these things increase costs to the government, especially when we are forced to make emergency repairs. For example, in our FY24 budget request, 13 out of 17 major capital projects are resubmissions from prior years, and this is now costing the government $300 million more than if it had been funded when originally requested. It is far more fiscally responsible to fund this work rather than to delay these projects. To that end, GSA's 24 budget request also includes a legislative proposal modeled after the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund scoring fix, which was championed by this committee. to ensure that GSA receives full access to the annual collections that are deposited into the Federal Buildings Fund. We would like to work with you to advance this proposal this year. GSA is also requesting to increase its prospectus threshold from $3.6 million to $10 million. The higher threshold will allow GSA to more quickly tackle routine projects, reduce repair costs, and save an estimated $50 million a year in cost avoidance. Finally, as GSA works to right-size its real estate portfolio, there will be properties that are no longer needed and that should be disposed of. To help accelerate the disposition of underutilized real property, GSA's FY24 budget request includes a legislative proposal to expand the allowable uses of the expenses, disposal of surplus real and related personal property appropriation. The expanded authority is not a request for additional funds. Instead, the proposal allows GSA to use existing funds on analyses and activities that support agency identification and preparation of real property for disposition. In summary, GSA and federal agency alignment around real estate optimization has never been better. With approximately half of our leases expiring within the next 5 years, we can seize this opportunity, but only if we're able to make the necessary investments in the buildings that the federal government will continue to own, because these are core assets, as well as accelerate the disposition of properties that are no longer needed. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you both for your testimony. We will now turn to questions for the panel. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Maroney. In this report that I'm showing here, and I particularly found a lot of interest in this page right here, this little graph down here, which shows the different quartiles and usage. It is quite honestly devastating. But Mr. Maroney, you found some agencies on average had a utilization rate as low as 9%. So that's 91% not being utilized, and at best 50%. And while agencies complained about uncertainty regarding future occupancy, they all admitted their attendance had stabilized post-COVID. One agency indicated that even if, as you testified, 100% of their staff came to work, only 67% of the building capacity would be used. Federal workers need to come back to the office for sure, but it's accurate to say that even if there were higher attendance numbers than pre-COVID, we are paying far more for space than needed. Can you tell us which agency indicated that only 67% of their building capacity would be used with 100% attendance?
So that's the Small Business Administration headquarters. That's our calculation based on our assessment of their usable square.
Yeah, did you press the mic button?
Oh, the button's on.
Okay.
I'll bring it closer to my.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was the Small Business Administration. To be clear, that was our calculation based on our assessment of their usable square feet. And
Can you inform the committee of the average square footage that you used to make the assessment?
yes. The usable square footage was roughly 228,000 square feet.
Right, and I think it bounces somewhere between 180 and 250 or something like that.
In terms of the benchmark agencies
Right,
use to plan, it can be as low as 120. Some use 150, 180. It ranges. They
So
don't
you're
have-
probably, this is a conservative estimate, I would
Correct.
think. Is one of the challenges that GAO highlights is that there are no standards for how agencies should measure utilization, right? Agencies say, well, we don't have anything that we can, they kind of make it up, and like you said, it varies. I think that they agree that there needs to be a benchmark, although no one wants to have someone else set it for them. I get it. Historically, GSA and the committee have used the basic calculation of dividing the number of people assigned to a building into the total usable square footage of the building, and I'm not sure that's you got hallways, you got closets, bathrooms, et cetera. I don't think it captures actual utilization. Is there a standard or benchmark on actual utilization that you would recommend?
So we don't have a specific benchmark we'd recommend. We use the 180 because that is a GSA benchmark. It's not a requirement for all agencies to use that. But we think, especially now that we have a more hybrid work environment, those existing measures, even the 180, may not make sense going forward. So we think it's important for that to be defined government-wide. What are our standards for measuring utilization, and what are targets that agencies can aim for in terms of maximizing their utilization?
Okay, in your review, you selected 180 usable square feet per person as a metric for determining utilization, yet GSA standard is 150, so that's 30 more. That means the actual utilization rates you found are even worse if you use GSA standard. What utilization rate would or should we be aiming for in federally owned lease spaces? What
level of utilization? Yeah. So that, I think, is part of what needs to be defined too. 100% is not necessarily what you're aiming for, but it's higher than 25%.
Okay, yeah, without a doubt, without question. Are there some that you can think of that should be exempted from a set standard right off the bat? Or are there any that should be exempted that do special things that might not fall into that category?
When you're talking about office space, so the kind of space we're talking about at these headquarters buildings, I think you can set a standard. I don't know if there's a single number. You always want 180 square feet per person kind of a number. But I do think you can lay out parameters. I don't think there's a specific agency I would off the hand say they should not be subject to a standard. There are always going to be exceptions that you can build into your policy. But we do think there needs to be some standard, some measure that's across the agency.
Okay, in the remaining time, in GAO's review, the GSA's headquarter building was among the group with the lowest utilization. Commissioner Albert, what's GSA? I mean, you guys are kind of leading the charge. You know, you're planting the flag. It's important that you set a standard. What are you guys doing about it?
So I actually think we're a fantastic example of what we're doing right, but also what some of the challenges are. So since 2012, GSA used to have 2 headquarters buildings in Washington, D.C., one at 7th and D, and our flagship at 1800 F Street. We also used to have 6 leases. After the freeze the footprint and reduce the footprint, we took that to heart. We consolidated those 6 leases into our headquarters. Then, right before the pandemic, we consolidated our 2 buildings into one, into the headquarters. So since 2012, we've reduced our own footprint by more than 40%, which we have tracked what those savings are to our agency over the 10 years to be more than $300 million.
Which is awesome, Commissioner, but
for 1800 F now, the utilization is very low.
My time has expired, and I want to be respectful of the other members of the committee, but I would just end my conversation with this. Still plenty of work to be done per the report. And with that, I yield and recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, the ranking member, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for y'all's testimony. In my opening statement, I mentioned some of the problems that y'all are having post-pandemic, and you addressed some of those, Ms. Albert, especially the funding issue, where you're short-funded, plus the federal building fund keeps being robbed by appropriations, and so setting it off and walling it off, kind of like the harbor maintenance fund, seems like a good idea. Put that money where it's supposed to go. One of the things, though, that I didn't mention, but I think we should talk about, are the political problems. And there certainly are political problems. I think about it, members want certain buildings in their district, earmarks or rose by any other name. There's competition between members for the placement of a building. Let's look at the FBI, for example. There's changing priorities because it takes so long, so the agencies may need something different, or parties may switch, and then priorities may change, may start talking about moving to Alabama, for example. There's the culture among agencies that they want their own building or they want a new building. There are buildings available on the mall, but we're talking about new museums in new buildings as opposed to repurposing old buildings, so that's kind of part of the culture. I remember, I've been here long enough to remember all the disaster with the VA hospital out from Denver. I know that's kind of separate from you, but it still illustrates the point. I would ask both of you, how do you deal with these political problems when you try to make these important decisions?
Well, Mr. Maroney has ceded his time to me. Well, I think that frankly, proper communication is key and most important because real estate, moving out of real estate or repositioning real estate takes time, and that time affords us to communicate well and to develop alternate plans. That doesn't always work. What might be the right decision from a real estate perspective may have other consequences. And so in those cases, we just got to navigate and try to find that win-win that makes sense for the agency, for the local community, and then also for the taxpayer. We are constantly navigating that. But like in all situations where there's differences of opinions, I think that communication and developing a plan that everybody agrees to becomes of utmost importance. And there's many examples of that. But I will say that once a decision is made, whatever direction it goes in, there needs to probably be a compensating or a mitigating answer to whatever got left on the table. So for example, if a new courthouse is built, we need to have the courage then to let go of the courthouse that wasn't renovated. So again, if a decision is made, everybody will accept that decision, whatever it may be, but there is an alternate and mitigating opportunity to continue to save taxpayer money. And that's then what we need to focus our plans and agreement to, rather than allowing that other facility to lay fallow, to cost taxpayer money, and to be underutilized.
I would say, in terms of targets I mentioned earlier, having targets for each agency in terms of how they're going to maximize the utilization of their space would be a good way, if there are political considerations coming into play on whether this facility or that facility should stay. Having targets, at least agency-wide, would allow some objective measure. I also think the importance of making a good financial argument for facilities that should stay or should go is important to show a good return of investment, and then good communication, good collaboration to try and come to a solution is important as well.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm not sure this problem will ever be solved, but those are good suggestions for dealing with it. Also, in listening to the chairman's questions and y'all's answers and reading your testimony, it seems to me that one of the main problems is just unreliable data. Data from one agency to another is different, 1 year to another is different. Would we be better off just having some uniform data collection plan across all agencies so we can compare apples to apples and really know what is happening?
Well, data certainly is a concern. That's on part of our high-risk area too, and has been there for years at this point. I think improving the quality of real property data is essential, and having standards for, particularly when we're talking about utilization, for how we measure utilization is really important so we can do an apples-to-apples comparison. For this work, there was data at headquarters we could use, but it varied in quality, and there wasn't a single benchmark, so these are estimates as a result. It would be better if there were clearer standards for how to measure.
Yeah, I think pre-pandemic, the need to measure occupancy was not something that was of high importance. And I would say that that's true within the public sector as well as in the private sector. Badging data is probably the most reliable and ubiquitous form of measuring occupancy of buildings on any given day. However, that technology and that equipment is not installed in every building across the United States, and that has cost to it. So I think that this area of exploration about what needs to be measured, what utility that data has for making real estate decisions, I think is an important topic of conversation now. But I will just say that from an industry perspective, it's a relatively new frontier that we're all crossing, and GSA has long been a leader in real estate, and so we're happy to be a partner in determining what the methodology is for calculating utilization, and also determining what data really needs to be measured so that it can be useful for all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair recognizes a gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Maroney, Director Maroney. When asked about the main causes for office space underutilization prior to and following the COVID-19 pandemic, you cited outdated and insufficient building configurations and increased telework. My first question is for Commissioner. Albert, if there are outdated and insufficient building configurations, as GAO reports, why is that data, along with operating costs, building repairs, and the number of federal employees and contractors in each building not shared with Congress or all made available through the Federal Real Property Report? And how is this committee supposed to comprehend the extent of waste if in federal buildings if the data available is insufficient or incomplete? To me, it seems difficult to measure the efficiency of federal buildings when key data is not collected.
Well, thank you very much for your question. The Federal Real Property Profile Database is specifically an inventory. So it's basically a count of how many buildings there are across the United States. There's complexities to getting that database just by itself, just number and location and address across all these buildings across the United States. We're still working on perfecting that database. However, that particular database is not an asset management tool. It does not incorporate, as you suggested, building condition, building liabilities, inefficiencies. It doesn't go into that level of detail. That level of detail, in many cases, is managed by us for our own portfolio or managed by individual agencies. GSA has reported that our backlog of deficiencies is close to $11.9 billion. When we've looked at the sum total of the amount of investment needed to get the existing portfolio up to what I call a state of good repair, meaning safe, operable, available to agencies, we're looking at an $11.9 billion investment. That's deferred maintenance. And that's why we are so concerned with getting full access to the Federal Buildings Fund, because it was when we stopped getting access about 12 years ago that this mounting liability number has been growing and growing. Prior to 12 years ago, when we had full access to the Federal Building Fund, we were able to keep our liabilities to about $1 billion a year. Now it's $11 billion in total. So yes, I agree with you that we need to keep working on that Federal Real Property Profile database and perfecting it, but it is not an asset management tool, and we would be happy to work with the committee on sharing what we know to be individual asset performance standards right now.
Thank you. Continue with the topic. You spoke in your testimony about the importance of ensuring projects are fully funded to better save the taxpayer money. However, all this committee seems to receive are proposals for discrete large projects with limited context on how they fit into larger efforts to consolidate and reduce space. How is the GSA utilizing data to identify and set priorities to better serve the American taxpayer?
So GSA works closely with agencies. Many times we have a good sense of what their real estate portfolio needs are, where they have excess space. We have some visibility into that. And so we work closely on a regional basis as well as on a national basis with agencies to craft their real estate strategy. It's not contained in a database per se, but it's contained with real on-site knowledge of that building condition and dynamics of what the agency is needing and whether or not our building can suit their needs or if a lease strategy is something that makes more sense. It's more of an art than a science in many cases. Obviously, benchmarks are useful tools to identify whether or not the request is reasonable, but specifically, every real estate request is typically in response to an agency-driven need that gets evaluated both for cost and others. And we try to make that information transparent to the committee. If there's more information that you require, we're always happy to make sure that you understand on a prospectus level project what the rationale is for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Maroney, can you start with answering a question about other data? Noted in your report, you focused on the headquarters, but you weren't able or did not go to regional offices or as far afield even as Washington State, or Alaska or Hawaii. Why not? Is there a limitation on your ability to do that in order to get a different picture?
So there were
And
two.
can you pull that microphone right to your face?
Right. How's that?
Better.
Good. So two reasons we focused on headquarters and not the larger federal real property footprint. First, data availability. In the headquarters buildings, there was attendance data we could use for our calculations. It varied in quality and type, but there was enough there that we could come up with these estimates. In the field, as we reported previously, there is just much more limited data available to make our calculations. So one, it was a data availability issue. And then the second reason is headquarters buildings generally have similar functions. It's office space for folks working on policy, working on administrative issues. Once you get out into the field, the variety of uses of federal property are from labs to offices to secure facilities, and comparing utilization across those may not make as much sense. So that's why we decided to focus in on the headquarters buildings.
Second, on the use of leased space, and are you able to do any sort of calculation on the use of leased space? For instance, both my offices in the district are leased, for example.
So most of these headquarters buildings we looked at are owned, although some of them are leased facilities. So the numbers you have here include both of those types. Again, just in headquarters, but we didn't see significant differences in utilization whether the buildings were owned or leased.
Yeah, great. Commissioner, can you talk a little bit about the federal building fund? So you mentioned that you used to have $1 billion a year for that fund, and now you don't. Why is that, and what can we do about that?
So GSA collects last year, for example, $10.4 billion in rent from other agencies. Those agencies' budgets are appropriated, and rental of space is included in their budget appropriation. The way that the Federal Buildings Fund was designed was to collect that rent and then have automatic authority to reinvest that money into maintaining buildings. And so about 12 years ago, that authority, so I call that a revolving fund, that authority was limited, and about $1 billion a year has been siphoned from the collections that GSA collects and redirected elsewhere. That shortcut...
By the appropriations committees.
Correct. That $1 billion a year haircut to our budget every year, most of it, half of it at least, has come out of our repair and alterations budgets. So that's telling why our buildings now today are in the condition that they are. What we are proposing is a fix to the Federal Buildings Fund so that it acts more like what the committee passed recently for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, which is a scoring rule fix, which would allow us and allow the appropriators to appropriate the full amount of the Federal Buildings Fund without hitting their appropriations caps. And so that's what we'd like to work with the committee on. That's what we're looking to work with the appropriators on. Here's what it does. The important part is, why do this in this time now when everyone's talking about reducing the footprint? It does cost money to save money. So we need to move agencies from one location to another. That costs money. Where they're moving to needs to be improved, either in our own buildings or into even a leased space. There's improvements or changes that need to be made to the physical footprint to accommodate a new agency and how the new agency functions. All of those activities take money. From a management perspective, I'm an infrastructure manager, basically. The most important tool for an infrastructure manager is to have reliable and adequate funding, because it takes 4 to 5 years to effectuate these plans. And so I need to be able to rely on a known budget 4 or 5 years in advance. And that's what's complicated when we are living on a year-to-year budget cycle and would like to structure the FBF more like a...
So does the opposite hold true as well? To move people from space to space, the space you're moving them from as well, you need to improve that before it becomes able to be disposed of?
Yes, the FBF funds can be used for all of these types of move activities. I'll give an example too. When we dispose of a building and take sales proceeds, that comes into the FBF, and that allows funding of other agency moves. There's lots of examples of that, but access to the federal building fund is incredibly important in order to effectuate consolidation.
Thanks for explaining that. Appreciate that. Yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Chavez DeReamer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this. I was at the roundtable several months ago in March, and I was as shocked then as I still am, I think, as a new member of Congress, recognizing the work that goes into holding a real estate portfolio when we often think that that's a private sector issue, and knowing that we have hundreds of millions of square feet that are underutilized is shocking to, I would imagine, myself and a taxpayer. And when I hear that there's going to be some consolidation, I'm appreciative of that I think you all recognize that we're wasting taxpayer dollars left and right. And the general question that I would imagine and that I do get is it feels like we want more money to waste money. And that's maybe a private sector thought, but I want to figure out a way to save our taxpayer dollars. And I think that there is going to be, probably some hard choices to be made within the portfolio to say we can no longer do this. And really, I know pandemic levels have exacerbated the problem. All the reports are showing that can we get people to work? But this even started years before that, and recognizing that we have to make some changes. And if this was a private portfolio, at some point we'd just close the doors and have to forego those buildings a little harder in the public sector when we're running the show. And so I hope that we can give you all guidance, and I hope that you will respond with better data, better information gathering to share with us so we can make the right choices for the American people. And with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Maroney, your report shows the time for action is now. That's what you've stated. We know that even before COVID, space utilization was bad, and it was wasting those taxpayer dollars, as I said before. So can you maybe, you touched on it a little bit, what are your recommendations today on the next steps to right-sizing the federal portfolio?
So, a couple things. First, agencies do need to make decisions now, soon, on what office space they need. How that's affected by attendance policies and office attendance. They need to decide on that, and then decide, okay, how much space do we really need? And then taking into account how can they go about doing that? Do they need a standalone headquarters building anymore? Are there ways to consolidate? Are there bureaus within their department where they can share space and therefore have better utilization?
But we're not starting that process right today, right? We should have been doing this years ago. So is that happening already?
There is some consideration of that already. In fact, there was OMB last year at this time put out a memo asking for agencies to restart the capital planning process. Agencies have submitted their plans to OMB, and some agencies have started to announce both their attendance policies and also starting to put out information about their real estate plans. So there is efforts there, and there have been efforts in the past. Last decade, there were efforts to reduce the federal real property footprint as well. So it's not that this has not happened at all. It's just post-pandemic, we have a particular need now to refocus and potentially make some hard decisions about what space we need.
And do we have a expected timeline? When should those be finished? When should we expect that we'll get the answers, not we're working on it, we're working on it?
Right. So I think that's important for the agencies to say, what is their timeline? For OMB, there's part of that. For OMB to say, what are our targets? What are we aiming for in terms of utilization? It is going to, once that decision is made, there is time it takes to consolidate space, to dispose of space. So there is a tail to this as well, which is why decisions soon are important.
Great, thank you. Ms. Albert, it's my understanding that more than 5,000 individuals work for public building service. What is the utilization rate for PBS occupied space?
So PBS, because we are in buildings across the country as building managers, I don't know what the exact utilization is, but we tend to be in buildings because we're serving the building. We function as a hybrid organization, so depending on what the job description is what dictates how often people are on site. As you can imagine, we have construction managers and architects, so those people aren't coming necessarily into an office every day. Instead, they're going onto the job site. So we have quite a range of different activities, and people's hybrid posture or how they work is reflected by the activities that's required of them. I would like to take a moment to answer maybe or just shed some light onto what is going on right now in activities. So we are the manager of real estate, i.e. we are looking at the supply side of real estate. What's the quality of the buildings? How much are they being used? What are the opportunities for consolidation? So what is the supply side of real estate? The agency is determining and deciding what is the demand side, how much space do they need? And then it's a work, the body of work is to marry those two. That work is ongoing. There's no deadline. It is actively ongoing all the time. There have been many consolidation projects that have been in motion for years. You know, St. Elizabeth's, which Representative Norton's very familiar with, has been a consolidation effort for over 15 years, and we're now coming to the end of realizing that consolidation plan. And there are many agencies that are exercising and continuing to refine what their consolidation or what their real estate plans are. Our job as GSA is to manage real estate when agencies contract, which is what the state that we're in now, generally, but there are other agencies that are expanding. And so it's not a net total of decrease that we're looking at, it's agency by agency, how are we meeting agency needs?
Well, thank you. My time's expired, and I yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks you, gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Albert, thank you very much for this last explanation that you shared with us. You are on the supply side. The demand side you have to deal with, and therefore you're in a very difficult situation, which you have explained to us, at least in part today, and I thank you for that. You cannot control your destiny. Your destiny is really controlled by the other government agencies that are making a decision based upon their needs, their budgets, and their budgets are often, well, always presumably controlled by us, and we frankly jerk them around. And so over time, they're growing. Next year, they're declining and the like. In that context, you are proposing in your 24 budget request certain reforms. One of those reforms apparently deals with the how you transition property presently held by the government to some other purpose. And it is in that area that I'd like to just focus for a moment and then your comments. In eliminating excess facilities across the country to cut costs, do you take into account the social economic impact of a building being disposed of or shuttered in a community? How do you address that issue? And what is the effect of it? Now, the decision may not be totally yours in that you're the receiver of a decision by some agency to reduce its footprint. So, but do you take into account the social economic, and how would you address that if in fact you have to dispose of a building?
Yeah. So I think that the decision by the agency, as you say, is theirs, and we are the service provider. But once that agency has made their decision, very often, by the way, it's difficult to get the agency to make that decision. But we are in a new day, and I think that more accelerated moves can be anticipated. Having said that, once that decision is made, GSA, before it determines to dispose of property, goes through an internal process first to see if there are other federal government agencies that are interested in that site before we would even consider disposing of it. But most importantly, if that decision is made to dispose of property, that's what triggers the outreach to communities to identify Are there alternate uses? Are there uses that that local government has for the site? And we are now, under this administration, developing the tools for measuring economic impact, which have not been applied in the past. That is where my expertise comes in, to try and identify how to do that responsibly, and how, especially when, right now is a very complex time for communities, because we are in contraction mode almost across the country. And communities are having to reposition how they think about the value of coming into downtown DC, for example, and remain vibrant. And so a lot of communities are thinking about repositioning towards hospitality, entertainment, other things other than office. And that's what the community needs to tell us, how our asset can best support their goals.
Thank you very much. I think it's extremely important that, in addition to what you have described, that there is a timing element, and that the decisions flow in a way that leave the community, should there be a decision to dispose of property, leave the community in the best possible position. And I can understand, or at least appreciate somewhat, the complexity that you're faced with, that you don't control the supply side, the demand side. One final point that I want to make, and I think we need to be very, very careful to avoid the one-size-fits-all. Mr. Maroney, you've basically marched down this so many square feet per federal employee. I think we better be very careful that that not be the criteria, because there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different demands. My final point would be that we need to be very, very much aware here that the GSA is the supply side. It is the demand side that is driving this problem. I'll let it go at that. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, ma'am. It's good to see you again. We sat at a round table together, asked you some very pointed and specific questions. Then you were not prepared to answer them for me then. It's been a while now, so I'm going to ask you the same questions. How many people are under your purview?
There are approximately 5,600 people.
Okay, excellent. So there's 5,600 people. It is 11 o'clock, 11:01 on July 13th, a Thursday. How many of those people are at work right now?
Everybody is at work.
How many people are physically located in a building that I'm paying for?
I could not answer that question.
Okay, so that's exactly what you told me a while ago, and that is completely unacceptable, ma'am. You've had a long period of time to get that answer. So we write checks here because that's what Congress does. And if you are incapable of answering that question, I don't know that you're capable of holding the position that you are in. So there are 4 GSA buildings in the state of Wisconsin, 4. One of them is in my district. It took me over 2 months to get a phone as a member of Congress in that office. And my guys are still having issues getting passes so that the people that work for me and work for the 750,000 Wisconsinites that we represent can actually go to work. And that's on you. And this is just not okay. It is not. I'm afraid to address you again publicly and bring in the word incompetent. Your testimony again is a pile of gobbledygook. It doesn't make any sense. I need a phone so my constituents can call me. I need an office so they can visit, so that we can actually problem solve. And that's on you, and you are failing. You are. Do you have any reasonable excuse for not being able to answer the most basic question of how many of your employees are physically located in a place where they can help American citizens? Do you have any excuse for that? Not being able to answer that question? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
We don't attribute being able to do our jobs to whether or not we're sitting in an office. Construction
you don't,
managers
ma'am.
are not in an office.
I get it.
They are out on a job site.
They are.
So there's a mix
How many
on a
construction
daily
managers
basis.
right now? How many construction managers right now are at a job site?
I
can't
don't
answer
have
that
a
question. You know
tally
why?
in
Because
my
you don't track your
pocket
people, ma'am.
of where everybody
Listen.
is right now.
Yeah, you don't.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm a retired Navy SEAL, and I knew where all my people were at all times. Everywhere, and I managed folks in 3 different combat zones simultaneously, and I could tell you within a 10-meter square where they were at in combat. And you can't tell me where administrative personnel are located in the country, and we're giving you how much money? That is, ma'am, that is completely unacceptable. And if you could, because I asked you to give me this answer and I wrote it down, it's in my notes. And if you're not taking notes from a member of Congress that's asking you very specific questions, because I got no answers back from you. If you're not doing that, you're failing. And I'm not going to accept this any longer. I'm not going to do this. This committee is remarkable. The power that this committee has it's not commiserate with the responsibilities that we have. We should be able to fire you right now. No, we should be able to fire you right now because you're failing. And you've been blowing me off now for a long period of time. I want specific answers. How many people, where are they at, what are they doing every day? Because we've got a checkbook and you don't.
If I could just, we would be happy to answer your questions.
Well, then,
There's a
ma'am, you should have
process
done it
for
a
doing
long
that.
time ago.
But may I also just say, in terms of failing, we are not failing. The last 3 years,
Where's my
our
phone?
projects have been delivered on
Why
time and
can't
on
my
budget.
people go to work? Why cannot my people that are being paid by the American taxpayers walk into an office in the single GSA building in my district? Why can't they go in there without being searched like they're a terrorist? Why? Are you happy to answer that question?
Sure, there are security protocols for each building that
Yes,
apply
there
to
are,
all
ma'am.
federal buildings, and that is the requirement of the agencies that are in those buildings.
Who's in charge of that agency, ma'am? Would that be you? It would be.
Security of a building is run by Department of Homeland Security. We have a partnership with the Department
owns
of
the
Homeland
building?
Security to provide security in
Ms.
buildings.
Albert, who owns the building? Who's actually responsible for that building? It is you. My time has expired.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington, D.C., Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Albert, Commissioner Albert, the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia is a federal agency that supervises individuals in D.C. on probation, parole, and supervised release. For the last 20 years, SESOSA's main facility has been located within 1 block of the D.C. Superior Court. As is the case with the Office of the U.S. Attorney for D.C. and the D.C. Public Defender Service, proximity to the court is important for SESOSA to carry out its mission and for the individuals it serves. SESOSA's lease expires in 2026. I believe it is important for SESOSA to remain located near the court after its lease expires. Does GSA understand the importance of SESOSA remaining near the court and support SESOSA, locating SESOSA near the court?
Thank you for that question. SESOSA is doing a tremendous amount of work with us right now. They're looking at consolidating multiple locations, and we're determining what their real estate strategy is. They have expressed the importance of the location and proximity of their facility to other mission-essential locations, and we will make sure that they are supported as they need to be.
I appreciate your looking closely at that, and they seem to be asking for that as well. Commissioner Albert, at the roundtable last March 1st, I asked you about GSA's plans for the Department of Energy's Forrestal building and for the old DHS headquarters once everyone moves to St. Elizabeth's. You stated that GSA was systematically going through the portfolio to understand agencies' plans and reposition assets to support the needs of the agencies and the local community. When does GSA anticipate to announce plans for the old DHS headquarters and the DOE's Forrestal building?
Thank you for that question. So you've been a champion of the DHS consolidation, particularly at St. Elizabeth's. As you know, in our 23 budget authorization, we were able to move 3 additional headquarters and consolidate them at St. Elizabeth's, or 3 additional projects. And we're asking in our 24 budget request for the last component to be able to be consolidated at St. Elizabeth's. And so we're hoping that if we get that appropriation, we'll be able to move the last DHS component off of what we call the Nebraska Avenue Complex site. If everything goes according to plan and we get funding this year for this last component, we believe that we'll be out of the Nebraska Avenue Complex in 2028. And prior to that, we would be working with the District of Columbia and with the community to determine what the best strategy is for making that site available.
What percentage of the portfolio do you have left to review?
Of the, you mean GSA's portfolio?
Yeah.
Well, it's ongoing. I don't know, we've gone, what we do is we go through multiple passes. So we've gone through one pass in its entirety, and this fall we'll have gone through that second it's to confirm what we know, or what we think we know, with the regions and with the agencies. That will happen through the rest of this calendar year.
Commissioner Albert, you also stated that GSA, and here I'm quoting you, would be delighted to work with DC on repositioning assets that have historic utilization, rising costs, and are not a long-term strategic goal for private use. Have you begun conversations with the District of Columbia on repositioning these assets?
So we are in contact with the District of Columbia. We understand what their strategies are for revitalizing and maintaining a healthy downtown core. We have not spoken about specific assets because we haven't completed our work yet with the agencies on how they might want to reposition. Having said that, we understand what the district is trying to do with its downtown, and we're trying to make sure that strategically our assets can contribute to the vitality of downtown.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? I don't believe that we see anybody else arriving today, but I do want to thank the witnesses for being here, because this will conclude our hearing. I think you've been asked some pretty poignant questions, some direct, some indirect, some more hostile than others, but I do believe that this committee's committed to getting the answers, and I hope that you'll be forthright and come with those answers that we've asked today, because I think the taxpayers, the American taxpayers, deserve to be saved their taxpayer dollars if the utilization continues to rise. And it's our due diligence then to do the best with the public buildings that we have, and that real estate portfolio continues to serve the needs that the American taxpayers deserve. So seeing none, this concludes our hearing. I'd like to again thank you for spending the morning with us. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in record of today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered, this subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.